Before the modern world of books, newspapers, and the internet, knowledge moved slowly. Ideas traveled only as fast as human hands could copy them. One invention changed that forever. Today, we explore the life and work of Johannes Gutenberg, the man whose printing press transformed how humanity records and shares information. This is not a dramatic legend, but a factual story of need, persistence, and technology. Before the invention of the printing press, books in Europe were produced almost entirely by hand. This work was carried out mainly by monks and professional scribes who copied texts letter by letter. A single large book, such as a Bible, could take months or even years to complete. The process required extreme concentration, steady hands, and long hours of labor. Because each copy depended on human effort alone, production remained slow and limited. This method made books expensive. The cost of materials such as parchment or vellum, combined with the labor of skilled scribes, meant that only churches, royal courts, and wealthy individuals could afford personal libraries. Ordinary people rarely owned books. Most had access only through religious institutions or universities, where a few copies were shared among many readers. Errors were another serious limitation. Each time a book was copied, small mistakes could be introduced. Over generations of copying, these errors accumulated. Words were omitted, lines were repeated, and meanings sometimes changed. Scholars had no reliable way to ensure that different copies of the same text were truly identical. This affected religious teaching, legal documents, and scientific knowledge alike. The handwritten system also restricted how quickly ideas could spread. When a new text was written, its influence depended on how many copies could be made and how far they could be carried. Communication between regions remained slow. Knowledge traveled at the speed of human hands and walking messengers. In this environment, learning advanced gradually, but its reach was narrow and uneven. By the early 15th century, European society was becoming more complex. Trade was expanding, cities were growing, and education was increasing. Yet the technology of book production had not changed in centuries. The gap between social development and information sharing was widening. A more efficient method of reproducing texts was becoming necessary, not as a luxury, but as a practical solution to an emerging problem. During the late Middle Ages, Europe experienced important social and economic changes. Universities were established in major cities such as Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. These institutions required textbooks for theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Students and teachers depended on written material for instruction, but the handwritten system could not keep pace with rising enrollment. At the same time, commerce expanded. Merchants needed contracts, account records, and standardized forms. Governments required laws, tax records, and official announcements to be copied and distributed. The church needed religious texts for worship and teaching. All of these activities relied on writing, and all suffered from slow reproduction. Literacy also began to spread beyond religious elites. A growing urban middle class wanted access to religious devotionals, practical guides, and eventually literature. This did not mean that most people could read, but the number of readers was increasing steadily. Demand for books rose faster than supply. Earlier forms of printing already existed. In China and Korea, woodblock printing and movable type had been used centuries before. In Europe, woodblock printing was sometimes used for playing cards, images, and short religious texts. However, carving an entire page into a wooden block was time-consuming and inflexible. If a single word needed to be changed, the whole block had to be recarved. This method worked for short or decorative items but was unsuitable for long books. The problem Europe faced was not simply how to print images or short texts, but how to reproduce long, complex works accurately and in large numbers. Scholars, merchants, and religious leaders increasingly depended on written communication. The old system could no longer meet these needs efficiently. Conditions were forming for a technological response, one that would combine mechanical force with written language. The idea of producing books mechanically required a change in thinking. Instead of viewing writing as a purely human activity, it had to be treated as a process that could be standardized and repeated. This meant breaking language into components that could be rearranged and reused. The key concept was movable type. Rather than carving a whole page from a single block, individual letters could be cast as separate pieces. These pieces could then be arranged into words and lines, inked, and pressed onto paper. After printing, the letters could be reused for another page. This approach transformed writing into a system of parts, much like mechanical tools. To make this work, several technical challenges had to be solved. The letters had to be uniform in size and shape so they would align properly. They needed to be made of a material that was durable but easy to cast. Ink had to adhere to metal rather than soaking into wood or parchment. Paper had to be strong enough to withstand pressure without tearing. The concept of a press was also essential. Instead of writing with a pen, pressure could be applied evenly across a surface. Devices such as wine presses already existed in Europe and provided a model for applying force in a controlled way. By adapting this principle to printing, large numbers of identical pages could be produced. What made this idea important was not only its technical novelty, but its social purpose. Mechanical book production aimed to solve a practical problem: the slow and unreliable spread of information. It offered a way to multiply texts with consistency and speed. In doing so, it promised to change how knowledge was stored and transmitted. When printing with movable type first appeared in Europe, it did not immediately replace handwritten books. Early printed works were still expensive and required skilled labor. Printers had to learn how to set type, prepare ink, and operate presses efficiently. Readers were initially cautious, unsure whether printed texts were as trustworthy as handwritten ones. However, the advantages became clear over time. Printed books could be produced in dozens or hundreds of copies within a fraction of the time required for manual copying. Texts were more uniform, reducing the number of errors. As production increased, costs gradually declined. Books became more accessible to students, merchants, and eventually ordinary citizens. Printing spread quickly from city to city. Workshops appeared across Germany, Italy, France, and England within decades. Printers adapted the technology to different languages and subjects. Religious works, legal codes, scientific treatises, and literature were all printed in growing quantities. The long-term impact was profound. The printing press supported the Renaissance by circulating classical texts and new ideas. It played a major role in the Reformation by allowing religious arguments to reach wide audiences. Scientists used printed books to share observations and experiments. Education expanded as textbooks became more available. The success of the printing press was not based on sudden change, but on gradual integration into everyday life. It aligned with existing needs for information, record-keeping, and learning. By replacing slow manual copying with mechanical reproduction, it created a foundation for mass communication. The printing press did not simply produce books. It reshaped how societies preserved knowledge, debated ideas, and organized institutions. Its importance lies in its function rather than its form. It solved the central problem of information scarcity by introducing a reliable, scalable method of reproduction. In doing so, it marked the beginning of the modern information age. Johannes Gutenberg was born around the year 1400 in the city of Mainz, located in what is now Germany. Mainz was an important commercial and religious center within the Holy Roman Empire. It had active trade networks and a strong tradition of craftsmanship. Gutenberg's family belonged to the patrician class, a social group involved in skilled trades and local governance rather than agriculture or nobility. His father, Friel Gensfleisch zur Leyden, worked in financial administration connected to the Archbishop's Mint. This meant the family had contact with metalworking, coin production, and regulated manufacturing processes. Such work required precision, standardized forms, and careful handling of materials. These conditions exposed Gutenberg from an early age to the idea that objects could be produced according to exact measurements and repeated reliably. Mainz also had political tensions between patrician families and guild members. These conflicts shaped the environment in which Gutenberg grew up. Social stability was uncertain, and families involved in trade and administration often faced pressure during periods of unrest. This background likely influenced Gutenberg's later preference for secrecy and controlled experimentation. Although little is known about his childhood in personal detail, the environment he grew up in combined urban life, skilled labor, and exposure to metal tools. This combination was significant. Unlike scholars trained only in religious or literary traditions, Gutenberg belonged to a world where physical materials and technical skills were central. His family background placed him between intellectual culture and manual craft, an important position for an inventor whose work would unite language with machinery. Gutenberg likely received a formal education typical of a well-established family. He would have learned to read and write Latin, the language of the church and of higher learning in Europe at the time. Literacy was essential for administrative work and religious study, and it also allowed access to classical and theological texts. This education familiarized him with books as objects of value and authority. Beyond written learning, Gutenberg was trained in goldsmithing and metalwork. Goldsmiths worked with molds, alloys, and fine tools to produce coins, jewelry, and decorative objects. These trades demanded exactness. A small error in casting could ruin a piece. Through this training, Gutenberg developed knowledge of metallurgy, especially how different metals behaved when melted and cooled. This technical knowledge later became central to printing. Movable type required metal letters that could be cast in large numbers and remain uniform in shape and size. Gutenberg's familiarity with molds and metal mixtures prepared him for this task. He understood how to create repeated forms rather than single handcrafted objects. His education combined three important elements: literacy, mechanical skill, and experience with standardized production. Most scribes knew texts but not machines. Most craftsmen knew materials but not books. Gutenberg belonged to both worlds. This allowed him to imagine writing as something that could be manufactured rather than only written. Rather than pursuing a career in the church or administration, Gutenberg focused on technical work. His skills placed him among urban craftsmen who experimented with tools and materials. This practical orientation distinguished him from purely scholarly figures and made him capable of developing a mechanical system for printing. In the early 15th century, Mainz experienced political instability. Conflicts between the ruling patrician families and local guilds led to changes in power and episodes of violence. During one of these periods, Gutenberg's family was forced to leave the city. They relocated to Strasbourg, a city known for its active trade and craft industries. This move had lasting consequences. Strasbourg offered a different environment from Mainz. It was a center of skilled labor, including metal workers, carpenters, and merchants. Here, Gutenberg could operate with more independence. Away from his original family base, he relied more on his own abilities and less on inherited status. During this period, Gutenberg worked on various technical projects. Records indicate that he was involved in the production of metal mirrors, which were sold to pilgrims. These mirrors were believed to capture holy light from religious relics. Although this belief had spiritual meaning, the manufacturing process itself required careful casting and polishing. This work further strengthened Gutenberg's experience in producing objects in quantity. The years in Strasbourg also encouraged secrecy. Gutenberg worked privately and avoided revealing the nature of his experiments. This habit likely developed because technical ideas could be copied and because failure could lead to financial loss. Political uncertainty made long-term planning difficult, so he focused on controlled, hidden development rather than public demonstration. Exile shaped his character. He became cautious, methodical, and focused on technical solutions rather than public recognition. Instead of pursuing social or political advancement, he concentrated on mechanical improvement. These traits later influenced how he approached printing, as a problem to be solved quietly and precisely. Very little is known about Gutenberg's personal relationships. Historical records do not clearly confirm that he married or had children. Unlike some later inventors whose family lives were well documented, Gutenberg left few traces of domestic life. What is clear is that his adult years were marked by financial difficulty. Developing new technology required tools, materials, and time. Gutenberg lacked independent wealth and therefore relied on loans and partnerships. This dependence often placed him in vulnerable positions. Creditors expected results, while experimental work progressed slowly. This tension created ongoing pressure. Gutenberg's life reflects the uncertain status of inventors in the 15th century. There was no formal system for funding innovation. No universities sponsored applied research. Success depended on private agreements with investors. When projects failed or took too long, debt accumulated. Gutenberg experienced several legal and financial disputes related to borrowed money. Despite these difficulties, he remained focused on technical development rather than personal comfort. His priorities were practical rather than social. He did not seek political office or religious authority. Instead, he invested time and resources in experimentation. This choice limited his wealth but enabled his invention. Near the end of his life, Gutenberg received a small pension from the Archbishop of Mainz. This provided some stability, but he did not become wealthy from his invention. His contribution was recognized slowly and indirectly, through the spread of printing rather than through personal success. Gutenberg's personal life demonstrates that the printing press did not emerge from privilege or institutional support. It was developed under financial strain, social uncertainty, and limited recognition. His persistence under these conditions shows that the invention was the result of long-term effort rather than sudden opportunity. During his years away from Mainz, Gutenberg began focusing on the problem of producing identical objects in large numbers. His work on metal mirrors had already required the use of molds, which allowed the same shape to be cast repeatedly. This experience suggested that written symbols might also be treated as standardized forms rather than unique drawings. At the time, most written texts were produced by copying with a pen. Even decorative printing methods, such as woodblock printing, involved carving entire pages as single units. Gutenberg's interest lay in breaking this model apart. He considered whether letters themselves could be treated as separate objects that could be arranged and rearranged. This idea required more than imagination. Each letter needed to be consistent in size and shape so that lines of text would align properly. This meant designing a mold that could produce hundreds or thousands of nearly identical pieces. The challenge was both technical and conceptual. Writing had to be converted into a system of components. Gutenberg also explored materials. Wood was too fragile and wore down quickly. Clay was brittle. Metal offered strength and durability, but casting small, detailed shapes demanded skill. His background as a goldsmith allowed him to experiment with alloys that could hold fine detail while remaining easy to shape. These early experiments were slow and uncertain. There was no clear model to follow. Gutenberg was not adapting an existing machine but combining several ideas: metal casting, ink formulation, and mechanical pressing. Progress came in small steps. Each test revealed weaknesses and required adjustment. What distinguished Gutenberg's approach was its focus on repeatability. His goal was not to create a single printed page, but a system capable of producing many identical pages. This emphasis on process rather than product marked an important shift. Printing was becoming an industrial activity rather than an artistic one. As Gutenberg's experiments became more complex, they required greater resources. Metal, tools, presses, and workspace all cost money. Gutenberg did not have the wealth to support this work alone. To continue, he sought financial partners who could provide capital in exchange for future profit. In the early 1450s, he entered into a partnership with Johann Fust, a wealthy financier from Mainz. Fust agreed to lend Gutenberg money for equipment and materials. Their agreement treated the printing project as a business venture rather than a purely technical pursuit. This marked a shift from private experimentation to organized production. The partnership introduced new pressures. Fust expected results within a reasonable time. Gutenberg, however, was still solving technical problems. Casting type, developing suitable ink, and designing a press took longer than anticipated. The mismatch between financial schedules and technical development created tension. Records show that Gutenberg worked in secrecy during this period. He employed assistants but limited their knowledge of the overall process. This secrecy was partly to protect his ideas and partly to control quality. Printing required coordinated steps, and errors in one stage could ruin entire batches of work. Eventually, conflict arose between Gutenberg and Fust over the use of funds. Fust accused Gutenberg of misusing money and brought legal action. Gutenberg lost the lawsuit, and with it, much of his equipment. This legal defeat did not erase the invention itself, but it did cost Gutenberg control over the first large printing operation. This episode shows that the printing press was not only a technical invention, but also a commercial enterprise. Its success depended on financial support, but that support came with expectations. Gutenberg's difficulty lay in balancing invention with investment. Despite financial difficulties, Gutenberg completed the key components of his printing system. The heart of the system was movable metal type. Each letter was cast separately using a hand mold. The mold allowed molten metal to be poured into a cavity shaped like a letter, producing uniform pieces that could be reused. The metal alloy Gutenberg used typically combined lead, tin, and antimony. This mixture melted at a relatively low temperature, flowed well into molds, and hardened quickly. The resulting letters were strong enough to withstand repeated printing, but soft enough to be reshaped if needed. Ink presented another challenge. Traditional writing ink was water-based and designed for parchment. It did not adhere well to metal. Gutenberg developed an oil-based ink that could stick to metal type and transfer cleanly to paper. This innovation was essential for clear and consistent printing. The press itself was adapted from existing screw presses used in agriculture, such as wine or olive presses. Gutenberg modified this design so that pressure could be applied evenly across a flat surface. The type was arranged into a frame, inked, and pressed against paper using controlled force. Together, these elements formed a complete system: cast letters, durable ink, and mechanical pressure. Printing was no longer a matter of drawing symbols but of assembling components. This system allowed for rapid production of identical pages. Errors could be corrected by replacing individual letters rather than rewriting entire texts. The development of this integrated process was Gutenberg's main achievement. Each part alone was useful, but only together did they create a workable printing press. The most famous product of Gutenberg's press was the 42-line Bible, produced in the mid-1450s. This work is known as the Gutenberg Bible and is considered the first major book printed using movable metal type in Europe. It demonstrated that the new technology could handle long, complex texts. The Bible was printed in Latin and designed to resemble high-quality handwritten manuscripts. The typeface imitated traditional script. Decorative elements were often added by hand after printing. This approach helped readers accept printed books as legitimate replacements for manuscripts. Approximately 180 copies of the Bible were produced, far more than could have been created by hand in the same time. Each copy contained hundreds of pages with consistent text. This uniformity showed that printing could achieve both scale and accuracy. The Gutenberg Bible served as a public demonstration of printing's potential. It proved that mechanical reproduction could preserve the authority and appearance of important texts. Scholars, clergy, and merchants could now imagine a future in which books were no longer rare objects. Although Gutenberg himself did not retain full control over the enterprise, the success of the Bible established the model for future printers. Other workshops quickly adopted similar methods. Printing spread across Europe within decades. The Bible was not only a religious text, but also a technical statement. It showed that movable type could produce durable, readable, and standardized books. This achievement marked the transition from experiment to established practice. Through this work, Gutenberg's journey reached a decisive point. The printing press moved from private trials to visible success. It became clear that written knowledge could now be multiplied mechanically, laying the foundation for widespread literacy and communication. The printing press developed by Gutenberg was not a single machine, but a system made up of several coordinated parts. Each component performed a specific function, and together they allowed written text to be reproduced mechanically and repeatedly. The most important component was movable metal type. Each letter, number, and punctuation mark was cast as an individual piece of metal. These pieces were stored in trays and selected by hand when composing a page. Because the letters were separate, they could be reused for different pages and different texts. To produce these letters, Gutenberg used a hand mold. This mold allowed molten metal to be poured into a letter-shaped cavity. The mold ensured that every piece of type had the same height and width. Uniformity was essential so that lines of text would print evenly. The ink was another critical element. Gutenberg developed an oil-based ink that could adhere to metal instead of soaking into it. This ink was thick and sticky, allowing it to coat the raised surfaces of the type without dripping into the gaps between letters. The press frame and screw mechanism provided controlled pressure. Adapted from agricultural presses, this structure held the arranged type in place and pressed paper firmly against it. The pressure had to be strong enough to transfer ink, but gentle enough to avoid damaging the paper. Finally, paper and layout frames completed the system. Paper replaced parchment as a cheaper and more practical surface. The type was arranged inside a wooden or metal frame, called a form, which held the letters tightly in position. Together, these parts created a new kind of writing machine. Language was no longer shaped by hand alone. It was assembled from components and transferred to paper by force rather than by pen. The printing process began with type casting. Individual letters were produced using the hand mold and metal alloy. Once cooled, the pieces were trimmed and stored in organized compartments according to letter type. Next came typesetting. A compositor selected letters from the trays and placed them into a composing stick, forming words and lines. These lines were transferred into a larger frame and locked into position. This created a complete page of raised metal letters. Once the page was assembled, inking followed. Ink was applied using padded balls made of leather and wool. The printer dabbed the ink onto the surface of the type, coating only the raised areas. This step required care to ensure even coverage without smearing. After inking, a sheet of paper was placed over the type. The frame was slid under the press and the screw mechanism was turned. This action lowered a flat plate onto the paper, pressing it firmly against the inked type. The pressure transferred the ink from metal to paper, creating a printed page. The paper was then removed and hung or laid out to dry. The type could be re-inked and used again immediately for the next sheet. This cycle, ink, press, remove, dry, could be repeated many times in a single day. When all pages were printed, they were assembled and bound into books. The same set of type could be dismantled and reused for another project. This reusability made large-scale book production possible. This process transformed writing into a mechanical operation. Instead of drawing letters repeatedly, printers assembled and pressed them. achieving speed and consistency. Before Gutenberg's system, the main printing method in Europe was woodblock printing. In this method, entire pages were carved into wooden blocks. Ink was applied to the carved surface, and paper was pressed against it. While this allowed multiple impressions, it had important limitations. First, woodblocks were not reusable for new texts. Each page required a new block. Changing even one word meant carving an entirely new surface. This made long books impractical. Second, woodblocks wore out quickly. The fine details of letters degraded after repeated use, reducing print quality. Repairs were difficult and time-consuming. Gutenberg's movable type solved these problems. Letters could be rearranged to form new pages. Individual damaged pieces could be replaced without recutting entire pages. This greatly reduced labor and cost. Speed was another major difference. Once type was set, hundreds of pages could be printed rapidly. Woodblock printing required preparation for every page from scratch. Accuracy also improved. Because the same type was used repeatedly, texts became more standardized. Variations caused by handwriting were eliminated. Readers could trust that multiple copies of a book contained the same content. These improvements turned printing into a scalable process. It could support large books, complex texts, and frequent reproduction. Gutenberg's system changed printing from a craft into a manufacturing method. The technical importance of Gutenberg's printing press lies in its structure rather than in any single invention. Modern printing machines are far more advanced, but they still follow the same basic principles: movable symbols, ink transfer, and mechanical pressure. Later improvements increased speed and automation, but Gutenberg's system established the framework. Type was standardized. Pages were assembled mechanically. Reproduction became repeatable and reliable. This technical shift had broad consequences. Texts could now be produced in large quantities with consistent content. This allowed knowledge to spread beyond local centers of learning. Scientific findings, religious ideas, and political arguments could be distributed widely. Printing also encouraged the development of standard languages. When texts were printed in large numbers, spelling and grammar became more uniform. This helped shape modern European languages. From a technical perspective, Gutenberg solved a systems problem. He integrated metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanics into a single process for producing text. The printing press was not just a tool but an organized method of communication. Its legacy continues in modern information technology. Just as printing multiplied written words, later technologies multiplied images, sound, and data. The printing press was the first large-scale technology for mass communication. By converting language into a mechanical process, Gutenberg changed how societies stored knowledge and shared ideas. His press became the foundation of publishing, education, and modern media. The invention succeeded not because it was complex, but because it was practical, repeatable, and aligned with human need for recorded information.